Italy's entry into the war on the 11th of June 1940 posed a serious threat to Britain's position in the Mediterranean and in Egypt and Palestine. It also jeopardized her oil supplies in the Middle East and her vital line of communication with India and the Far East through the Suez Canal. The Italian Air Force had 330 frontline aircraft in Libya, 150 in East Africa, and some 1,200 in Italy itself. The RAF, meanwhile, could muster no more than 205 serviceable aircraft in Egypt and Palestine, and only 163 in East Africa. What's more, most of these were obsolete types. On the ground, the disparity in numbers was even more marked. Commander of the Middle East forces, General Wavel, had only 63,000 troops opposing 250,000 Italian and native troops in Libya. Further adding to his problems, Wavel had the task of policing Iraq and Palestine following an Arab rebellion in June 1940, and also to keep an eye on the Vichy French in Syria. In Abyssinia, a further 300,000 Italian and native troops opposed a force of little more than 10,000 British troops, who were based in scattered garrisons in the Sudan, British Somalia, and Kenya. The picture looked very bleak for Wavel and his men. On the 11th of June, the day they declared war, Italian aircraft bombed Aden and Port Sudan, whilst the RAF attacked Italian-held airfields in Libya. British troops crossed from Egypt into Libya and ambushed an Italian truck convoy. These were the opening shots of the war in the desert. On the 4th of July, the Italians attacked and captured the British posts on the Sudan borders with Eritrea and Abyssinia. A month later, they invaded British Somaliland. At the same time, a revolt by Abyssinians loyal to the Emperor Haile Selassie also got underway. On the 22nd of August, Churchill ordered a heavily escorted convoy carrying 150 tanks and reinforcements to the Middle East. The Italian invasion of Egypt began on the 13th of September. The British Western Desert Force immediately began a withdrawal. Its orders were to fight a delaying action back as far as Mersa Matruh, then stand and fight there. By the end of September, however, this drive into Egypt came to a halt. Mussolini, aware that the reinforced British now outnumbered his tanks in Egypt, decided to turn his attentions to Greece, which he invaded in late October. Shortly after the invasion, the Greeks mounted a counterattack which sent the Italians reeling back into Albania. Wavell now considered his own plans of counterattacking, with the objective being the Italian divisions in Egypt. However, whilst considering this new objective, Wavell had to consider the possibility of the threat from the Italians in East Africa, and also the fact that he might, at short notice, be ordered to send part of his force to counter any threat in Greece. The Italians, although strong in numbers, had one major weakness, which Wavell had spotted. Their troops and artillery were spread in separate camps over a wide area. Consequently, they were too far apart from each other to pose a threat as a whole. By the 11th of December 1940, Wavell had already captured 38,000 prisoners and a large number of guns and tanks, leaving the Italians with only 3 positions in Egypt. By the 20th of December, there were no Italians left on Egyptian soil. The counter-offensive began in earnest. On the 5th of January 1941, Australian forces captured Bardia in Libya. Another 38,000 Italians were taken prisoner at a cost of only 500 Allied casualties. Later that month, the port of Tobruk was captured. 25,000 more prisoners were taken, along with a further 200 guns and 87 tanks. The British government now ordered Wavell to press on and capture Benghazi. The 6th Australian Division was sent north of the Jebel Akhdar in Cyrenaica. The 7th Armoured Division were deployed in an outflanking movement south of Benghazi to trap the Italians as they tried to break out. The Allies entered Benghazi on the 6th of February. This was the first real victory for the British on land. The resulting euphoria, however, was short-lived. In that same month, the Italians received the support they needed when Hitler, fearing Italy might leave the war, ordered 3 divisions along with anti-tank units and aircraft to reinforce the Axis troops in Albania. A new commander entered the theatre, General Rommel. Landing at Tripoli along with 2 divisions of infantry and panzers, the Africa Corps were immediately sent into action. Rommel's immediate orders were to recapture Benghazi, then Tobruk. Wavell now had a problem. Whilst his other divisions were successfully clearing the Italians out of East Africa, the war in North Africa was to take a turn. Wavell's worst fears were realized when the British ordered 4 divisions of Wavell's troops to Greece. This represented a substantial slice of his already stretched forces. By March, Rommel, with his 5th Light Division and 15th Panzer Division, had moved on Benghazi, driving the British back on the defensive as he went. Unopposed, the Africa Corps entered Benghazi on the 4th of April. 7 days later, Rommel began to attack Tobruk, but, unlike Benghazi, the British garrison there held fast. Despite failing to take Tobruk, Rommel's entry into the campaign had been little short of sensational. Numerically inferior to his enemies, he had driven the British back to where they had been 5 months previously, behind the lines in Egypt. For Wavell, the fact that, apart from Tobruk, which was now cut off, he had lost all of his gains of the winter, this was only one of many problems that he now faced. In Greece, now in German hands, many of his men had been captured. The remainder had retreated to Crete. In Iraq, there had also been a turn in events. Rashid Ali, the newly self-appointed leader of Iraq, turned his troops on the British air bases, which now came under siege. In neighboring French-ruled Syria, the Vichy presence threatened British-controlled Palestine and pro-British Transjordan, and thus the Suez Canal was also under threat. Furthermore, adding further to Wavell's problems, a directive was issued by Churchill to drive Rommel's divisions back and also to secure Syria and the Lebanon. This directive was supported by the arrival of a convoy carrying supplies, tanks, and aircraft at Alexandria. On the 8th of June, British, Indian, Australian, and Free French forces crossed into the Lebanon from Palestine and Transjordan. 30,000 Vichy French troops, dug in along the coastal roads, resisted furiously. But after a month of savage hostilities, with the Syrian capital Damascus falling on the 21st of June, a ceasefire was negotiated, giving the Allies the right to occupy both Syria and Lebanon. Also, on the 15th of June, Wavell's men attacked the German garrison at Halfaya Pass. The battle was a bruising affair, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Following a counterattack by Rommel, the British had to withdraw, and as a result, their losses were much higher. 91 tanks were lost against 25 panzers. For Rommel, this was a victory. But Tobruk was still holding out, denying the Germans the much-needed port to bring in reinforcements. For Wavell, it was the end of his desert campaign. He was sent to India to exchange jobs with his replacement, General Auchinleck. There now followed a 5-month lull in the war. In the besieged port of Tobruk, with the threat of attack at any time, the troops remained on constant alert. In September, they survived a mass attack by 100 dive bombers of the Luftwaffe.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
In October, 8 months into the siege, they beat off numerous tank attacks. On the 18th of November, in a bid to relieve Tobruk, the British crossed the frontier from Egypt into Libya. The next day, they clashed with the Italian armoured brigade at Bir el Gubi. Meanwhile, a secondary unit seized Sidi Bezar. The Italian defenders were caught completely unawares. At the same time, the British were also attempting to break out of Tobruk, but the Italians held firm. Rommel, now alerted to the offensive, sent in his panzers. There followed the first large-scale tank battle of the Desert War. Rommel's Africa Corps then attacked the British 7th Armoured Division at Sidi Bezar. Hopelessly outnumbered, the 7th was almost wiped out, reducing them to only 10 serviceable tanks. But for the British, this was only the start of a much worse scenario to come. In some of the fiercest fighting of the whole Desert War, a panzer division found its way blocked by the 5th South African Infantry Brigade. They refused to give ground to the panzers and died where they stood. One British tank commander later described the scene. It was a frightening and awesome spectacle. The dead and the dying strewn over the battlefield in trucks and Bren carriers, in trenches and toppled over in death. Trucks, guns and ammunition was smouldering or burning. Tanks of all kinds, British, German and Italian, littered the whole area. However, although this was a German victory, Rommel's Africa Corps was badly battle-scarred, and he had neither the manpower left nor the resources for any further engagement with the British. The Allies relieved Tobruk on the 10th of December. Rommel's campaign had not gone well. He had received no reinforcements whatsoever, not even a single tank to replace his losses. In addition to which, He was running desperately low on fuel. By the end of January, Rommel was back on the offensive again. However, by the time his panzers reached Gazala, only 50 kilometers from Tobruk, they were virtually out of fuel and certainly not strong enough to take on the British Eighth Army. It wasn't until the 26th of May that Rommel was once again on the move. His aim? To punch his way through the Gazala line of defense. By June, he was gathering momentum and was bringing up his reserves for the assault on Tobruk. Auchinleck launched a counterattack. It went disastrously wrong. On the 11th of June, Rommel trapped a great deal of the British armour at Knightsbridge, and by the 13th had destroyed it. By the 14th, Rommel was within 15 kilometers of Tobruk. The Allied defences held, but the British could not keep Rommel at bay for long. On the 16th, the British withdrew, and by the 18th, Tobruk was completely cut off. Rommel launched his assault on the city. On the 21st, Tobruk finally fell to Rommel and the British began a desperate withdrawal. Churchill later referred to this day as one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. Rommel had achieved his prime objective, but not only did he have control of the port, he had also captured thousands of gallons of fuel, tons of supplies and rations, and over 2,000 vehicles. 2 days later, a resupplied and re-equipped Rommel was on the move once more, this time crossing the border into Egypt. The British had pulled back to Mersa-Matruh, which Rommel took on the 27th of June. General Auchinleck, hotly pursued by Rommel, was deliberately falling back to El Alamein, and it was here that he intended to stand and fight. His tired and much depleted army began the task of digging themselves in. The Allied front consisted of a series of belts of minefields with strong points, along with machine gun and anti-tank emplacements. Here, the men waited for Rommel and his Afrika Korps. The position looked bleak, but this was about to change. Help was on its way. Winston Churchill visited the scene in one of his morale-boosting tours. He brought with him hope and inspiration for the men. He also brought good news. Reinforcements and fresh supplies were only days away. Churchill spent 5 days visiting as many men of the army and the RAF as possible. He explained the task ahead and its importance. He also brought with him 2 new generals, General Alexander and General Montgomery. Alexander was one of the last men off the beaches at Dunkirk, and it was his small army which held off the Japanese throughout the length of Burma. He was to take overall command, whilst Montgomery was to assume command over the Eighth Army. An expansion of the Eighth Army began. Into Middle East ports came reinforcements from Britain, India, and South Africa. 2 divisions had left Britain in May, along with a new supply of tanks, the first American Sherman tanks, courtesy of President Roosevelt. Long-range planning by the Allies was now beginning to reap its rewards. Into the western desert poured a seemingly endless convoy of men and machines. Overhead, the Royal Air Force kept a constant lookout for enemy aircraft. Rommel was also bringing in new tanks and fresh reinforcements. General Montgomery's Eighth Army was being supported in the desert by the RAF under Air Vice Marshal Cunningham. At the request of Montgomery, there was no divided command. They worked and planned together. Monty, as the men called him, was a firm believer in making sure that every man in his command knew what was going on and what was expected of him in the months to come. He saw to it that the plan of battle was passed down through the ranks and shown and explained to every man in the chain, from general to private soldier. Not for the first time, Rommel was facing problems. He had been suffering ill health and had to return to Germany for treatment. Furthermore, extra supplies which he had been begging for failed to materialize. The British plan, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, was to draw Rommel's tanks away from the northern area, which would then allow the British armoured divisions to break through the German defences and establish itself in a position to threaten Rommel's dwindling supply lines. By the 23rd of October, all was ready for the attack. The main phase of the Battle of El Alamein began that evening. As the light failed, the final moves were made. By early morning on the 24th of October, the first objectives had been achieved. The night-long barrage of guns had completely taken the Axis forces by surprise. Fighting amongst the infantry, however, had been severe and losses were high on both sides. Meanwhile, the RAF continued to attack the German defences, clearing a path for the infantry to move up. This was a model combined operation, infantry, tanks and air force all working as one unit. The RAF flew sortie after sortie, keeping the German fighters and dive bombers at bay. The skies became a place of deadly peril. But it wasn't only in the air that the Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses. Those machines that didn't get airborne in time were systematically destroyed on the ground. Despite the superiority of the Allies, progress was slow. The Axis forces were fighting back desperately. In the north, progress was difficult, as the infantry had to work their way through deep enemy minefields, holding up the 1st Armoured Division in the partially opened lane behind them. Allied bombers continued to pound on the Germans and Italians from behind their lines, cutting off any hope of reinforcements being brought up. General George Stummer, Rommel's deputy in charge whilst he was in Germany, was killed on the 25th of October. Rommel was forced to return to the battle. On the 27th of October, Rommel used his armour to try and counterattack, but these attacks were soon beaten off by the Allies. By the 2nd of November, the battle having raged for a week or more, Montgomery launched a new plan, codenamed Supercharge, a concentrated and mass effort to hit Rommel. It began in the early hours of the morning. Rommel's troops were soon under pressure, and with fuel by now desperately short, he was forced to begin the withdrawal of his forces. An order from Hitler told him to stand and fight to the last man, but it was too late. By the 4th of November, the 8th Army was ready to break out. Unlike a few months earlier, when Rommel had pursued Alexander's men to El Alamein, the Afrika Korps, hopelessly broken, had no other choice than to pull back. This time it was the turn of the 8th Army to do the pursuing. But this new 8th Army under General Montgomery was a much larger and much more powerful force. On the first day of Rommel's retreat, he lost a further 50 tanks with no losses to the Allies. Behind him on the battlefield lay over 500 of Rommel's tanks and more than 1,000 pieces of artillery. Tens of thousands of Germans and Italians were taken prisoner. Among them von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Korps, Burckhardt, leader of the German parachutists, and no less than 8 Italian generals. 20,000 men had died in the battle. In the air, the RAF continued to chase Rommel out of North Africa, attacking his tanks and convoys as they raced across the desert. Ground, Rommel's flimsy rearguard was crushed in the wake of the advancing Allies. On the 7th of November, Mersa-Matruh was back in Allied hands. By the 10th of November, the 8th Army was making its way through the twisting mountain paths of Hellfire Pass. Tobruk was recaptured on the 13th of November, reopening the port for further Allied shipping and supplies. Meanwhile, Rommel continued to pull back even further. On the 20th of November, Allied troops were once again reoccupying the port of Benghazi. Montgomery's supercharge was gathering momentum. At El Agila, Rommel's forces halted. Hitler and Mussolini had ordered that he should launch a counteroffensive from here. Rommel wanted to withdraw to Europe. That being impossible, with all the ports now in Allied hands, Rommel considered that the only way to salvage something from this was to join the Axis forces in Tunisia, and by the 13th of December, continued his withdrawal. Montgomery was to pursue Rommel for the next 41 days over a distance of 800 or more kilometers, fighting all of the way with Rommel's rear guard. General Montgomery said in his orders of the day, "Nothing has stopped us since the Battle of Egypt began. Nothing will stop us now." And nothing did. By the 22nd of January 1943, Montgomery and the 8th Army had reached the outskirts of Tripoli, and a fierce battle opened once again. The Allies entered Tripoli on the 23rd of January, and the town was surrendered to Montgomery. Country by country, they had systematically destroyed the whole of the Italian Empire.
You have altered the face of the war in a most remarkable way. What it has meant in the skill and organization of movement and maneuver, what it has meant in the tireless endurance and self-denial of the troops, and in the fearless leadership displayed in action, can be appreciated only by those who are actually on the spot. But I must tell you that the fame of the Desert Army has spread throughout the world.
Churchill and Roosevelt had been finalizing plans for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Three landings would be made. Crucial to the success of the landings was the degree of resistance from the French. At Casablanca and Algiers, there was heavy resistance. At Oran, signals were sent out to shore installations for them to indicate whether or not they would resist by aiming their searchlights vertically. Before long, all along the coast at Oran, searchlights could be seen. Next morning, RAF fighters took off from Gibraltar to Algiers. By 7 a.m., the beaches at Algiers were cleared. British and American troops of the Eastern Task Force had landed to the east and west of the city and secured all main positions and vantage points. Meanwhile, American paratroops and airborne infantry of the Center Task Force were dropping onto the area around the coastal city of Iran. They had flown from Britain some 2,400 kilometers away to secure the airfields, whilst other amphibious troops were about to attack the beaches. At Casablanca, the landing craft of the Western Task Force, led by Major General Patton, came under protection of the Royal Navy, their gunners beating off enemy fighter attacks. Dive bombers, battleships, and heavy gunboats continued a heavy barrage on the French shore installations, which had still remained hostile. before long, having taken the beaches, the Allies had penetrated the city itself and French resistance came to an end. Meanwhile, the Germans were pouring men and equipment into Tunisia, both by sea and air. Allied infantry, tanks and artillery began to move inland towards the hills. By rail went the French mountain troops with mules for transport. By air went British and American paratroops to capture enemy airfields and suitable landing grounds. By sea, the No. 6 Commando Battalion travelled from Algiers to Bona and Bougie. At Bona, some 100 kilometres from the Tunisian border, paratroops had already secured an airfield, which repeatedly came under heavy attack from the Luftwaffe. This was the only forward Allied airfield and had to be kept at all costs. By mid-November, over 1,000 German soldiers a day were arriving at the port of Tunis. Hitler was determined that Tunisia should be held. On the 18th of November, Allied troops crossed the frontier into Tunisia. Fighting all the way, the units of British, American and French troops pushed on. Time was short. Any delay meant extra days, allowing extra German troops to be brought in. By the 22nd of November, they had reached the town of Béjar, approximately 100 kilometers from Tunis. 50 kilometers away, at Majez el Bab, the French, armed with little more than rifles and machine guns, were fighting furiously against the Germans. General Anderson, commanding the First Army, moved his tanks up to support them. Together, they forced the Germans out of this strategic strongpoint, and the advance on Tunis and Bizerte continued. However, the steppe took the Allies into the plains, which meant that they were much more vulnerable and exposed to attacks from the Luftwaffe. On November the 25th, the first major tank battle took place. "15 German tanks were destroyed in the battle. The remainder pulled back. All was not well for the Allies, however. Supplies were being cut by the Luftwaffe, and supplies were running low. But still the advance didn't falter, and before long they were approaching the coastal city of Bizerte in the north, and further south the city of Tunis. There followed a ferocious and bloody counterattack by the German tanks and artillery. The Axis offensive worked. The Allies were forced back, withdrawing to the safety of the hills. This marked the final attempt by the Allies to break through. Too few troops, combined with the worsening weather conditions, proved decisive. They needed time to consolidate and repair their supply lines before attempting again. Rommel, meanwhile, still being pursued by Montgomery's 8th Army, was fast approaching from the south. Tunisia was packed with German troops, 15 full divisions moving up for the offensive. But these were no rookie troops. These were some of the Wehrmacht's finest battle-experienced veterans of Poland, France and the Balkans, along with 7 divisions of Italian troops. Air Marshal Cunningham, commander of the Air Force, and General Alexander, in command of all ground forces, worked together at their camp in the Tunisian mountains, planning the next phase of the assault. The first move was made by Air Marshal Cunningham. A continuous 24-hour assault was mounted from the air. In the desert, Montgomery was planning his attack on the Mareth line of defense. On the 20th of March, Montgomery began his attack. By the following morning, only 4 tanks had managed to break through, but this was enough to form a bridgehead, and the British infantry fought long and hard to keep that bridgehead intact. The Germans, fearing another defeat like El Alamein, pulled their armor back from other areas and threw it into the battle. Meanwhile, Montgomery's armor was racing across the desert towards El Hama. 50,000 men on the ground, supported by the fighters, bombers, and tank busters in the air, were about to descend on the German defenders. Possibly fortunately for Rommel, ill health once again necessitated his return to Germany. He was never to return. His place was taken by von Arnim. Now pinned down, it was too late for the German armor. The New Zealanders ploughed through the Tobruk Gap. Major General Patton was sending his armor in from the west towards the eastern dorsal, concentrating his attack in cutting off von Arnim from the rear and securing Montgomery's left flank. By the end of March, small pockets of men from Patton's No. 2 Corps met up with the advance parties from Montgomery's battle-weary 8th Army. 50 kilometers south of Tunis, with von Arnim closing up from the rear, the French fought a long, hard battle. The noose was beginning to tighten on the Axis forces. Montgomery's armored divisions were closing in for the kill. In a last-ditch attempt to reach Tunis, von Arnim and his Army Group Africa called upon almost all of his remaining tanks. In 3 days of fighting, Montgomery's purpose was accomplished. Von Arnim's tanks and artillery, having been drawn into the battle, had been destroyed. The Africa Corps had been all but wiped out. In the hills overlooking Tunis, the First Army fought a long and hard battle. For 12 days, the hills echoed with gunfire. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. When the German lines finally crumbled, the dead lay in hundreds across the battlefield. As the Allied infantry advanced, engineers and pioneer corps built roads across the mountain ranges. In 14 days, they built 17 kilometers of road. On this hilltop, known as Hill 609, long-range artillery of the United States Army started the attack. By the time they finally reached the top, many Allied soldiers had been killed. But with this and subsequently others that followed, one by one, the German strongholds in the mountains around Tunis were falling. The Allied commanders knew then that the time was right for the last final all-out offensive. British and American armored and infantry divisions spearheaded the advance. In the hills, French artillery bombarded the remaining German strongholds. The Royal Navy pounded the shore installations and ports. This was a concentrated effort on all fronts. Hitler's and Mussolini's forces were being dealt a taste of their own medicine. Blitzkrieg. By air, the Allied bombers kept up the relentless attacks. On the ground, the advancing Allies smashed their way through. The Axis forces were forced to withdraw. After only 8 hours of fighting, German resistance was beginning to flounder. The Allied tanks and armor broke through the final defenses. By mid-afternoon on the 7th of May, the Axis forces began to surrender around Tunis. At first, the soldiers trickled out in small groups, but before long, the trickle turned into a flood as the German and Italian soldiers threw down their arms and surrendered in their thousands. In Bizerta, it was the same story. 275,000 men were taken prisoner as North Africa fell. There had been no chance of a Dunkirk-type evacuation for these men. The Royal Navy had been waiting to strike at any mass evacuation attempt by the German Navy. The orders of the day had read, "Sink, burn, destroy, let nothing pass." The Allied air forces had kept the Luftwaffe at bay, deterring any attempt to land transport aircraft to airlift the men out. Of those troops that managed to commandeer small boats to take them to Sicily, only 700 managed to escape the net cast by the Royal Navy and Allied Air Force. Von Arnim and his commanders had followed Hitler's orders, fighting to the last bullet, but surrendering. Army Group Africa was no more. The Axis forces, overwhelmed in terms of sheer numbers, had exhausted their supply and reserves of petrol and ammunition. Lieutenant General Hans Kramer, heading the remnants of the Afrika Korps, had fought on bravely, but having fired their last salvo and final rounds of ammunition, Kramer had signaled German High Command. Munitions expended, weapons and war equipment destroyed, the Afrika Korps has fought to a standstill as ordered.
In a German cemetery, one of their tanks, which had taken cover behind the graveyard hedge, makes its own funeral pyre. A direct hit from a shell, and it burns itself out on the site of its own choosing. The ruined dots of Tunis from which escape was made impossible. No wonder there was no Dunkirk for the Axis. The doors out of Tunisia were sealed with debris. For the moment, Tunis is expecting an outbreak of street fighting. Slit trenches have been hastily dug in the streets. In buildings, behind barricades, groups of Germans are still in hiding. Cornered men can fight desperately, so tanks and vehicles feel their way in as the Allied occupation begins.
General Alexander signalled to Churchill, "Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All resistance has ceased. We are the masters of the North African shores." The Axis forces had put up a fierce resistance until the very last, in a situation which they knew could have but one end. The North African victory was a prototype for future Allied joint operations. Strategically, it provided a springboard for further Mediterranean operations, including invaluable sites for air bases. British losses in North Africa from the beginning of the war amounted to 220,000 in all. The French lost 20,000, and the Americans suffered some 18,500 casualties. Axis losses in casualties and prisoners in the North African campaigns amounted to 620,000 soldiers, 1/3 of them Germans. Moreover, Hitler's grasp on North Africa was ended.